The 2013 Daniel Radcliffe-led film, Kill Your Darlings, is a biographical drama set in the 1940s that explores the formative years of the Beat Generation poets, focusing on the relationships between Allen Ginsberg, played by Daniel Radcliffe, Lucien Carr, played by Dane DeHaan, Jack Kerouac, played by Jack Houston, and William S. Burroughs, played by Ben Foster. It begins with the aspiring writer Allen Ginsberg as he meets the charismatic and enigmatic sophomore Lucien Carr when he first arrives at Columbia University and introduces him to a world of defiance and rebellion. Carr also introduces Allen to his friends Jack Kerouac and William S. Burroughs, forming a close-knit group of young intellectuals. As Allen becomes increasingly immersed in this new circle, he witnesses the unconventional and passionate lifestyles of his new friends. They challenge societal norms, experiment with drugs, and explore their artistic freedom. However, their relationships are tested when David Kammerer, an old mentor and current abuser of Lucien, becomes increasingly unhinged and possessive toward the boy. Tensions rise as Lucien tries to break free from Kammerer's influence, and the situation ultimately leads to the death of David Kammerer. The film delves briefly into the aftermath of the murder, exploring the legal and emotional consequences faced by the characters. That's the gist of the movie. But is its depiction of these events, particularly around Kammerer's death, accurate? If you have any questions about the veracity of this story presented to us in the film, hopefully this video will shed some light on what really transpired on that fateful night. Although the focus will not be on the forming of the beatniks, but the murder itself, as this was the aspect of the film I found most compelling. Most people acknowledge that this film takes liberties, but Lucien's son, Caleb Carr, takes it 10 steps further, calling the film a tired, ludicrous reading of the story of the murder case, based almost entirely on Allen Ginsberg's version of events. He goes on to accuse Ginsberg of revising the facts of the case to serve his own ego and agenda. While Caleb is probably the best source we have to determine the truth of the matter, it's important to note that he, like Ginsberg, may also have motives for distorting the truth, considering this case revolves around his father. But as you'll later discover, Caleb didn't hold his father in such high regard either. But that's sort of the point of this video. I want to explore a polar opposite perspective on the events. Whereas the film was from the point of view of Ginsberg, here we will have Carr's version of events, mixed in with some other sources I used for context. So here are the facts of the case from Caleb's perspective, as given to us from an interview with the Daily Caller. Caleb's father, Lucien Carr, was about 12 years old when he first encountered David Kammerer, who was his Boy Scout troop leader. Kammerer used his position of trust to gain access and influence over Lucien's life. Understanding that Lucien's father abandoned him when he was 5 years old, Kammerer therefore became the first real sympathetic adult male influence in the life of an angry and very confused boy, and he used that position to leverage even greater access to him. Kammerer took Lucien on private trips to Mexico, for example, and all this odd behavior led people to suspect something was up. To thwart any such suspicions, Kammerer feigned interest in Lucien's mother, who again was a young single mother. Caleb calls out the absurdity of classifying their relationship as an example of that love that dares not speak its name, considering Lucien was a child. He says, "It was prolonged, sustained child abuse, begun at an age when my father was looking for an adult man to be intimate with, and when Kammerer could sexualize this relationship with ease, since, like most such victims, Lucien had very little idea when it began of whether or not such was standard behavior in all such surrogate relationships. Lucien felt repulsed but trapped by Kammerer, as their relationship was the only experience of both intimacy and kindness from an adult male that he had known as a boy, and he unquestionably felt flattered." Caleb doesn't mention this, but Lucien appears to have attempted suicide by stuffing his head into a gas oven when he was attending the University of Chicago, presumably due to the fact that Kammerer followed him there. While he played it off as a work of art, his mother wasn't convinced and transferred him following his 2-week hospital stay. This man followed Lucien basically everywhere, in fact, from Phillips Academy in Massachusetts to Columbia University in New York. Back to Caleb's interview. He asserts that Lucien wasn't able to gain an understanding of the manipulative and predatory tendencies of Kammerer until he attended Columbia. At this point, Kammerer had quit his job and moved to New York to become a janitor, just to stay close to his victim. Another aspect of Lucien that Caleb doesn't delve into is the effect his father seemed to have on other people. He has been described by the Paris Review as possessing a mixture of delinquency, good looks, and intellectual charm. People, specifically homosexual men, were just naturally drawn to him, as it was with Ginsberg, which is something the film actually presents fairly accurately. You can tell from the moment Radcliffe sets eyes on Dehaan that he is infatuated and almost entranced. In his biography, Ginsberg writes that Lucien is the most angelic-looking kid I ever saw, with blonde hair, pale and hollow of cheek, which is also something the film presents pretty well, with Dehaan's naturally beguiling presence in nearly every scene. So that's what Caleb is referring to when he says, Alan, a homosexual who my father, who had long since learned to manipulate homosexuals, had no trouble making into his friend in a very adoring way. And it was this heavy crush that Alan developed on my father that led Alan to develop this deliberately distorted view of the murder story that he periodically propagated in an attempt to successfully injure my father as retribution for his failure to return Alan's affections. Caleb Carr seems to hate Allen Ginsberg, if that wasn't clear here. And so when he claims that the film adaptation was based almost entirely on Allen Ginsberg's version of events, he's saying that the filmmakers twisted the story into a romanticized version of events as Ginsberg preferred to think of them. But the person who Caleb truly credits for bringing clarity to Lucien on these issues is Jack Kerouac, whom he describes as a man's man, in stark contrast to the misfits he hung about like Allen Ginsberg and Kammerer's friend William S. Burroughs. According to Caleb, you can tell how enormous of an influence Kerouac had on his father simply by looking at photos of him before and after he met the man. He evolves from being very much the blonde, smooth-faced, pretty boy to a darker, mustachioed adult man. Whereas the film and Ginsberg himself portray Lucien as a closeted homosexual, or at the very least bisexual, Caleb believes his father was strictly heterosexual, which might not seem all that important, but it becomes a very important detail following the murder. Unsurprisingly, Caleb despises the film's portrayal of Jack Kerouac for how they sideline his influence on Lucien in favor of Ginsberg. He credits Kerouac for becoming the kind of safe father figure he had never had, and had wanted Kammerer to be. Lucien began going after women with Kerouac and distancing himself from both Allen and Kammerer, the latter of whom was driven mad by his sex object's shift toward independence. Although it's unclear who instigated the physical conflict on that fateful night, Caleb asserts that it was no longer between a man and a Boy Scout leader and a Boy Scout, but a man and a man moving in different directions. Caleb doesn't actually describe the specifics of this night in this interview, but an article in the New York Times does. So we'll be using this article to account for the murder and the trial. Then we'll finish off with the rest of Caleb Carr's statements. In August 1944, Lucien Carr and Jack Kerouac had planned to sail to Europe as merchant mariners, as French poet Arthur Rimbaud once did. But they showed up to their ship late because they had gotten too drunk the night before. In the film, they don't make their ship because Kammerer shows up, but that's not accurate. Instead, Jack and Lucien hit the West End bar to drown their sorrows. Kerouac left early and ran into Kammerer. When Kammerer asked the Standard, "Where's Lucien?" the intoxicated Kerouac directed him to the bar and watched him rush off to his death, as Kerouac wrote later in his novel, Vanity of Deleuze. It's important to note at this point, Lucien had a girlfriend, an aspect of history the film dropped altogether. Kammerer and Lucien hung about the bar until around 2 or 3 a.m., then making their way to Riverside Park, where Kammerer reportedly made an offensive proposal. Lucien refused, which is where this vague fight ensued. But we know it was one Lucien could not have won. A 5'9", 140-pound youth versus a burly, 6', 185-pound man is not exactly a fair fight. So Lucien, in a desperate act of survival, whipped out a relic of his boyhood, his Boy Scout knife, and stabbed Kammerer twice in the chest. Lucien proceeded to tie his former Boy Scout leader up with his own belt, stuff his pocket with rocks, and dump him in the Hudson River. According to the New York Times, Lucien immediately rushed over to William S. Burroughs in Greenwich Village and confided in him, even handing the man a pack of bloody cigarettes. Burroughs flushed the cigarettes and told his friend to report the crime to the police and frame himself as a victim of a sex fiend, which by most accounts is accurate. Rather than taking this advice, he woke Kerouac and casually said, "Well, I disposed of the old man last night." Lucien and Kerouac proceeded to bury Kammerer's glasses and the Boy Scout knife in Morningside Park and a subway grate, respectively. Rather than turn himself in, Lucien decided to go with Kerouac to the Museum of Modern Art, Times Square, and a cinema. Eventually, Lucien did confess to the killing at the district attorney's office, where they simply did not believe him due to his casual manner of speaking and how he simply sat there reading Yeats. To convince them, Lucien showed them the location of the buried glasses, which was around the time when Kammerer's body was discovered. Lucien was charged with second-degree murder, while the press framed this incident as an honor slaying, which in this case is essentially when a homosexual makes an unwanted sexual advance on a heterosexual, and said heterosexual uses violence as self-defense. This is why Lucien Carr was so insistent that he was straight, because being a proven homosexual would render his claim invalid. Caleb Carr notes that, although he refused to accept the exculpatory explanation of an honor killing, the judge in the case did accept that Kammerer had put my father into a psychological pressure cooker, out of which, after going on several years of stalking and abuse, he finally burst in a fit of explosive violence. And this was not a judge who was homophobic or inclined, as I say, to let criminals off purely on anti-gay explanations. As stated in the closing text of Kill Your Darlings, portraying David Kammerer as a homosexual predator, Lucien Carr pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter for his murder. He served only 18 months in a reformatory. While this is correct, the choice to say portraying rather than a word like exposing seems like the filmmakers may not believe Lucien's claims that Kammerer was truly a predator, or maybe they're just highlighting that there's no way to truly know what happened, and all we have to go off of are biased accounts from people like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and in our case, Caleb Carr. Caleb continues discussing his frustrations with the film, particularly one scene that both opens and closes the film involving Lucien begging Allen for help, which he describes as nothing but another of Allen's fantasies. He notes that court and police records show that Lucien was entirely fatalistic about his punishment, as the article earlier mentioned that he was reading Yeats immediately after his confession. At this point in the interview, Caleb explores why pushing this narrative was so important to Allen Ginsberg, which he describes as not simply personal, but philosophical and disturbing. And this portion simultaneously gives us some deeper insight into Caleb's own beliefs. At this point, Ginsberg began pushing an extremist narrative that even the activist gay community felt was going too far, that all men are inherently gay, but most are simply too repressed to embody it. He goes on saying, with the increased recognition of gay rights in so many states, and the probable acceptance of nearly all parts of the mainstream gay platform in the near future throughout the country, if you want to maintain the militancy of the cause, you have to assert this essential homosexuality of all men. At this point, I became a bit skeptical as to how unbiased Caleb's account was, as he clearly harbors some very strong opinions against Ginsberg. But with his next point, I began to understand why. Aside from everything he's done to his father, Allen Ginsberg was an early proponent of the North American Man-Boy Love Association, referencing one quote where he said, "To consider pedophilia a crime is ridiculous." I was certain this had to be a joke or something, so I sought some context. The full quote is not much better. Everybody likes kids. All you've got to do is walk through the Vatican and see all the little statues of prepubescents, pubescents, and postpubescents. Naked kids have been a staple of delight for centuries, for both parents and onlookers. So to label pedophilia as criminal is ridiculous. This revelation was pretty shocking for me, as someone who didn't know much more about Ginsberg outside of what the film portrayed. I found an article discussing a man-boy sex ring that was busted in 1977 in Revere Beach, Massachusetts, which led to the indictments of 24 men. Allen Ginsberg made light of this scandal on live television, saying, "I had sex when I was 8 with a man in the back of my grandfather's candy store in Revere, and I turned out okay." And this was a very sad realization for me because I know that Ginsberg was a very influential figure in promoting gay rights back in the day, and to see how he devolved into promoting something so despicable is pretty upsetting. Again, I'm not familiar with his work or his life really at all. If someone has any information they want to provide some deeper context to these statements and his involvement in this organization, I'd love to hear it. I currently struggle to find a way to view Ginsberg's image favorably as the film does, though I acknowledge that there may be some aspects or perspectives that I'm not fully grasping. Now back to Caleb's interview. He claims that his father's key takeaways from his experience with Kammerer was that he did not want to be gay, which is a quote I feel like could have been phrased better, and I'm not quite sure what this means. Is he implying that not being gay was a conscious choice Lucien made? Probably not, but that's how it reads for me. He then explains how his father fits into this cycle of abuse. Although Kammerer did indeed turn my father into an abusive monster, my father did not have the strength or character to seek out any kind of professional counseling that would have prevented his embodying such monstrous behavior himself. Lucien viewed everyone as a threat, even his children, claiming he had to get to them before they got to him. He seemed to view abusing his children as somehow forming a special bond between them and himself, which Caleb reflects is a terrifying mentality. Caleb ends this passionate segment with, "I guess what I'm saying, in sum, is that you're right to consider my father the victim of a sustained campaign of criminal child abuse. And that is the real story behind the murder that united the beats." The irony about this movie, of course, is that the true story, insofar as I've pieced it together, would have made a far more interesting tale. But it would not have served the sexual agenda of John Krokaitis, of Daniel Radcliffe, or of the very extremist wing of the gay movement that they demonstrated themselves as representing. A pity, but this is the disease of our times. The subordination of truth to agenda. It has stymied history, personal and national, and it has stymied politics. It may just be the end of the nation, for as James Madison wrote so long ago, only the diseases of faction can destroy a democracy. I have to mention that, while I believe Caleb Carr lets his hatred of Ginsburg influence his opinion a bit too much here, I totally understand where he's coming from, especially after learning of the abuse Lucien inflicted on others following the death of Kammerer, and some of the odd choices of Ginsburg later in life. And I find it really strange that the filmmakers never reached out to Carr's family in any manner, which, while I don't believe the creators of the film had any nefarious intentions, as Caleb does, leads me to believe that the creators had a very specific vision in mind that they wanted to execute. And I'd like to think that the monologue Ginsburg has about Lucien at one point loving Kammerer was supposed to be viewed as Ginsburg illuminating some of the effects this trauma had on Lucien, rather than the filmmakers justifying Kammerer's actions in some way. And I do think that's what Ginsburg's point is when he says,
"They become part of who you are."
Most likely, these changes were because John Krokaitis felt that a movie about a repressed homosexual arguing a case in which exoneration requires him to be straight made a compelling story. So that's why he favored Ginsburg's telling of events over Lucien's. And maybe he felt that having a forbidden romance at the center of the story would add an extra layer of tragedy to it. But even though I think the film is well made, incredibly well acted, and to a degree well written, I feel like the use of creative license was misplaced. If Krokaitis wanted to write a movie about a repressed homosexual arguing this honor-slaying case, it would be much more interesting here if you make Lucien the main character and focus much more on his upbringing and his struggles with Kammerer, rather than Ginsburg and his struggles. It just feels like he wanted to make two different movies here, and the less interesting one got most of the screen time. But that's just my opinion, and I'm still a bit conflicted on how I feel overall about the changing of certain aspects. And I'm sure there are a ton of people who prefer the time the film spent on the formation of the beatniks to Lucien's disturbing situation with Kammerer, and that's valid. But to conclude this video, this was just a discussion I thought was sort of interesting, and I just felt like the story wasn't really covered a whole lot. Maybe the whole Ginsburg thing is a big misunderstanding. Maybe Krokaitis has made statements implying some sort of defense of Kammerer. Again, this video is not meant to be a definitive account of what happened, but to explore an alternate perspective of the events outside the film. So if anyone does have some information to share on the topic, please let me know in the comments section. I'd be very interested to hear about it. This is very fascinating to me.